Hello, folks. My name is John Wood Jr. I am a national ambassador for Braver Angels, and you are here participating in another edition of the America's Public Forum speaker series. And so, very grateful to have all of you here today. We are grateful to be joined by a few fantastic speakers who I will introduce very shortly. First thing I want to mention, however, is our partners for tonight's proceeding. We have two wonderful organizational partners for tonight's event. Beginning with the National Institute for Civic Discourse. NICD is a nonpartisan organization based at the University of Arizona with a mission of promoting healthy and civil political debate among the American people. And this event is also co-sponsored by the American Project. The American Project is an initiative of the Pepperdine School of Public Policy. It is focused on reimagining a communitarian conservatism. Full disclosure, I myself happen to be an advisor to that project. And so, folks, we have a wonderful conversation ahead of us. One little thing I'd like to say about it just very quickly. Oh, by the way, Ibrahim, would you mind shooting around links to NICD and the American Project for anybody who might like to look at those organizations? Excellent. One little thing I'd like to say about our evening tonight is that it has to do with sort of a subject matter that is near and dear to sort of the Braver Angels' reason for being, an examination of civic life in America, of civil society, and a reacquainting with what does it mean to be engaged in the sort of communal life of democratic society beyond merely voting, beyond merely doing the thing that is the national pastime for most Americans, and that is shouting at pundits on your favorite or least favorite cable TV channel. First, a brief round of introductions. We are joined tonight by a few of my, by three individuals who, and I can say this with total honesty, are all folks who have influenced my thinking and sort of shepherded my intellectual development around some of the issues we're going to be talking about tonight over the course of the last few years or so. So it's humbling for me to be able to get to sort of, be the amateur in this conversation. So to start with, I want to go ahead and introduce my friend, Pete Peterson. Pete is the Dean of the Pepperdine School of Public Policy. He is the co-director of the American Project, our co-sponsor for this evening, and a former candidate for Secretary of State in the state of California, somebody who surpassed all expectations in that particular endeavor. Mr. Peterson, it is good, Dean Peterson, pardon me. It is good to have you here tonight.
Great to be with you, John.
Absolutely. We are also joined by Harry Boyte. Harry Boyte is the Senior Scholar of Public Work Philosophy at Augsburg University. He's co-director of the Institute for Public Life and Work. Harry, how are you?
I'm good, John.
Absolutely. And last, but certainly not least, is a face that will be familiar to many of you here, but if he is not, we are joined by Mr. David Blankenhorn, who is president and co-founder of Braver Angels. Boss, how you doing today?
Good to be with you, John. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, man. Absolutely. Okay, great. Well, David, since it is written that the last shall be first, since I introduced you last, why don't you go ahead and start us off? And so here's my prompt to you to get this conversation rolling. Many students of American democracy will be well familiar with Democracy in America, the writings of Alexis de Tocqueville. Somewhere in there, de Tocqueville writes that, quote, "The despotism of faction is not less to be dreaded than the despotism of an individual," meaning an individual tyrant or dictator or someone like that. Braver Angels' work has had to do with creating sort of the context for political depolarization. But in your understanding of a healthy civic culture, a healthy civil society, a healthy democracy, what are the ingredients for a social fabric and a free society that actually works? What do we need to know about the character of citizenship and self-governance that can point us in the direction of achieving the type of politics and society we might like to see?
Yeah. Thanks, John. Well, Tocqueville in the 1830s called them voluntary associations. And he said these were a really distinguishing feature of American life. In fact, in Democracy in America, he said, if you want to do a great thing, if you want to achieve a great goal for society, in France, you go to the court. In England, you go to a man of rank. In America, you start an association. And Tocqueville viewed this as a kind of a distinctive quality of our society, that we form associations to do everything. And I think even in COVID, don't you think, I mean, it was a sort of, in response to the COVID crisis, we didn't have a kind of a national, you know, it was kind of left a lot to localities to handle things. And I think that that has strengths and weaknesses, but that's this American tradition of having a plurality of associations, families, churches, civic groups that really take up a lot of the meaning of our life. You know, it's not the individual level, it's not the state, it's that in-between level. So my own take on it is that the health of civic life, our how we talk about politics, how we talk about our lives together, the stuff we see on television about this. My argument, John, I think would be that a lot of that depends on the health of these institutions, this civil society network. And I think I would just say three very quick points about it. There's still a very vibrant civil society in America, always has been. It's just been a remarkable trait of the country. I think there's some divisions going on in it now that are not good signs. One is the class divide. Starting with families and really extending out, there's a fair amount of stability among the upscale 30% or so of the society, but for the majority, there's been a real weakening almost across the board, particularly among men. The sort of detachment of males in 70% of the society that's not upscale, not affluent. This is a big thing, and this is a very not good trend. The other thing is that some parts of civil society build bridges to other among diverse people. Others dig in with real specific identities. We're in a period of civil society now where there's a lot of this digging in with very particular like-minded people, and that can be really good, but it can also isolate us from one another. So the bridging part of civil society today, I think is, I don't know, feels weak to me. And the final thing I'll say is that there's been a political sorting of civil society. So instead of just having, you know, churches that consist of, you know, Baptists and Methodists and Catholics and Jews, now everybody, well, almost everybody goes to a church of politically like-minded people. So you go to church with people who share your political views. That is increasingly true. Maybe not so much among Catholics. I don't think as much among Catholics, but I think among most of the Protestant denominations, I really think that's true. I can't speak for Judaism, but in general, there's a red and blue dimension to our civil society institutions that's not healthy, because if there's no connection across lines, if there's no bridging of class lines and racial lines and political lines, if civil society doesn't have strong muscle in those domains, I think that's a danger sign for us. And so I think the toxicity of civic life today, of political life today, the ugliness we see, the coarseness, the horrible behavior, the dysfunction, the inability for political people to do anything other than shout at one another. I think one of the engines of that is the weakening of civil society along these three lines: political, you know, class division, political division and class and politics. So stop there.
Indeed. So Pete, part of what David mentioned was this political system of civil society in this way to where even our institutions are now being divided according to their progressive versus conservative leanings, and we're losing the bridges that connect us. And part of what I notice in our politics is that we have a tendency, or many people do anyway, to want to evaluate one another, even with respect to each other's character, in a way that equates character to political point of view. And so I've got a quote to throw at you. Most folks know Adam Smith is the author of Wealth of Nations, sort of cornerstone work defining our understanding of market capitalism, etc. He also wrote a book called Theory of Moral Sentiments. By the way, just for folks watching, you will all be quizzed on each of the quotes that you hear articulated here and all these obscure references. So, keep track. But Adam Smith had a quote in this particular book of moral philosophy that reads somewhere along the lines of, he said, "What institution of government could tend so much to promote the happiness of mankind as the general prevalence of wisdom and virtue? All government is but an imperfect remedy for the deficiency of these," seeming to mean that the real root of our ability to be self-governing lies in our character and maybe things that are beyond political ideology. And so, Pete, my question to you to start off with is, first of all, sort of what does it take for us to have a healthy sort of civic culture in America, a healthy civil society, and where in that is there a role for some understanding of character that maybe goes beyond whether or not you are left or right?
Well, thanks, John. And already here in the first 10 minutes, we've named two of the core texts here at the Graduate Policy School in Tocqueville's Democracy in America and Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiment. So I'm very grateful for that. I did want to go back to David's good point in quoting one of my favorite quotations from Democracy in America, because I think it ties into the Smith quotation in this, that what sometimes we forget about with Tocqueville, who obviously is known as celebrating the virtues of American civil society, is that it requires certain things. It's not just like it's in the water, right? And from my perspective, it requires really three basic things. And again, this is where I think Smith and Tocqueville tie in nicely together. One is, for civil society to flourish, it demands a limited government. And one of the things that Tocqueville talks about quite readily, especially when he talks about building a road, which is that reference in that quotation that David mentioned, is that there weren't any other options at the time in the 1830s. And so there was, without a major national or federal government presence, if you wanted to get things done, you had to rely on the civil society organizations or associations that Americans felt quite ready to develop and build. But that also necessitates a certain degree of membership, right? That these civil society organizations, flourishing as they do, demand certain responsibilities of their members. And in that, there needs to be a sense of membership in whatever that organization is, whether it's the local Lions Club or the local Catholic Church or whatever the case might be, that there are these associations that are distinct. It's not just a bunch of associations, and it's not just a single association. It's this patchwork, this quilt work of associations that have different reasons for people to joining. But with that, I think, and this is the part I think for me is I'm going to keep coming back to over and over again in this conversation, is that it demands a love of place. And in that, I think the kind of energy that connects someone to a particular association, that prompts them to do things in their civic capacity, is a love of the place in which they live. Now, that's a very hard thing to quantify, but my experience has been, and we're doing a lot of work at the local government level around the state and sometimes around the country, is that this work tends to get done by people who really love where they live. That's not to say they don't understand that things need to be changed, and that's where the civic action happens. But there demands a certain degree of affiliation and love for the people they live with and for the place in which they live. And so in that, there develops this kind of virtuous cycle of civil society, which is civil society grows out of places where there's love of community. And as people affiliate and participate, they also enhance and strengthen civil society. So civil society has an impact on the individual, which then has an impact on the, dare I say, collective, or maybe better, community. So I think those three things are really necessary. There needs to be a space for civil society to operate. There are really things that only they can do. And that does demand a limited government. But these other two aspects of associational life, having membership and particularity, along with the love of the place in which you live, I really think are the 3 points that support one another in improving and strengthening civic life.
So, Harry, let's key in on that word love very, very quickly. And it may seem a little bit counterintuitive to focus in on a term that seems so sentimental, but one of the things that you and I talk about quite a bit is the philosophy of nonviolence and the tradition of Martin Luther King Jr. and Bayard Rustin, etc. One of the things that Dr. King believed was that love is something that exists as a social value that can be applied to social questions. And he described the beloved community for which Dr. King and his work strove in this way. He said, the aftermath of nonviolence is the creation of the beloved community. So when the battle is over, a new relationship comes into being between the oppressed and the oppressor. King had this philosophy of loving your enemies in the context of our political and social divisions. But that wasn't just about getting certain bills passed. That was about creating a sort of democratic society that lives up to America's highest ideals. How do you view the work of citizenship, building of civil society, civic society, life, democracy, in the context of nonviolence and the virtues that nonviolence called for in the character of the American citizen?
Well, there's a certain urgency to revive the deep philosophy of nonviolence as I would call it a philosophy of everyday life. People think about it either as a tactic, not responding violently in demonstrations, or they think about it as pacifism. But in the movement, nonviolence was a set of disciplines and ways of engaging others that refused to hate, that saw that change begins with oneself. Redemption begins with oneself, as King put it. The practitioner of nonviolence first experiences change in oneself, the unleashing of self-respect and courage and power one didn't know one had. It also had, people think about it as a kind of simply affect. It was powerfully emotional and value-laden, but it was also political, a different kind of politics. So in King's great pilgrimage to nonviolence, the first principle is nonviolence is much harder and much more engaged than violence. Nonviolence is a way of engaging opponents and wrestling with the differences. And Gandhi said the same thing, actually. The second principle was the best way to proceed is to understand one's opponent, even one's enemy, rather than seek to defeat or humiliate them. Now think for a minute how different that is in our politics today. And it wasn't only individual, it certainly was individual, but it was also, it informed the great moments of the movement, like the March on Washington. People often say today that they're doing a march like the March on Washington. That's rarely true. The March on Washington was not a protest, and it was designed not to be polarizing. So Bayard Rustin, who was the great strategist of the march, the organizer, had been a mentor of King in nonviolence in politics. He framed the march as a way to win over the middle of America, with the argument that a third of the country was broadly for the movement's goals, a third was against, which I should say at that point were most of my extended family in the South. I'm a Southern boy. And most of our family had disowned us as my father became very active in school desegregation efforts in the late 50s and early 60s. And Dad was on the staff of SCLC by 63. So I actually heard King practice I Have a Dream from my father's hotel room, which was next door to King's practicing it. But Rustin's strategy was, so a third was for the movement, a third was against, maybe even more, like 40% were in the middle. They had their own concerns. They were vaguely sympathetic. They had seen the dogs and the police hoses in Birmingham. They cared about injustice, but it was not their issue. So Rustin framed the march as a way to have a conversation with the American people. And so that's the way to see King's great speech, I Have a Dream. He was actually having a conversation with the American people about what we share, the dreams we share, the common commitment to realizing the promise of democracy. But the other thing that I want to transition to, nonviolence was not simply a philosophy that was articulated by great leaders like King or in great texts like his Stride Toward Freedom. What gave the march its power was the everyday citizens who came from across the country on buses, on railroads, on cars, sometimes by foot, to be involved. And the program notes of the march read that in a neighborhood dispute, there may be stunts, rough words, and hot insults, but when a whole people speaks to its government, the quality of the action in the dialogue needs to reflect the worth of the people and the responsibility of the government. So it was a call to think in bigger terms, in civic terms, and it was partly because there was a lot of worry that there would be efforts to, by provocateurs, to destroy or disrupt the march and get it to turn violent. So it was a call to discipline and a call to nonviolence and a call to citizenship. If you read King's speech, that's a major theme. But the point about the marchers was it wasn't simply the march. Many had been schooled in grassroots citizenship schools. I worked for the citizenship schools of King's organization. We had more than 900 across the South. And they educated people in nonviolence. They also developed people's literacy skills to pass stringent tests. There was a historical dimension. Unlike a lot of activists today, there was a professed love of America. We love America, that was one of the sections. And it wasn't a naive view, it was we love America and we're going to change it. We're going to realize the democratic promise. But the discipline that people developed and the knowledge people developed in the citizenship schools was a real foundation for the march and for the impact it had. So I would say a couple of other things. One is there was in the movement certainly the associational life that David and Pete were talking about. Our citizenship schools, for example, were held in church basements and community centers. There was also another dimension that was absent from Tocqueville, but it was really central to the movement. People cared about place and they cared about democracy because they felt they were helping to make it. There was a very strong work dimension. So if you remember, King's last great speech was the dignity of labor, how every work in which you uplift humanity has dignity and it has value and needs to be recognized. And that was a deep tradition that was the African-American tradition, with the 40 acres and a mule, the quest for land and property that would be the foundation for full participation. But it was also an old American tradition, which Tocqueville didn't really talk about, but Americans cared about places because they felt they made places. For all the exclusions, I'm not going to romanticize the past, but it created what the historian Robert Wiebe called a portable democracy, which meant that people built communities. They built the schools, and they built the roads, and they built the churches, and they built the community centers, and they built the village greens. It gets to the same point that actually Pope Francis gets at in his wonderful climate encyclical Laudato Si, where he says, caring and cultivating are inseparable. You don't care about something if you don't cultivate it, by which he means you help to take care of it and create it. And you don't cultivate it unless you care. So Americans cared about the places, and they cared about democracy because Americans felt they were building democracy. And what that did, so I agree that associations were important, but what's usually overlooked in contemporary discussions, it wasn't only voluntary associations. It was the local church, it was a local school, it was a local city government, it was a local business. They were also seen as civic institutions which anchored civic life in communities. And that was very powerful in the movement itself, in the civil rights movement.
David, you frequently hear conservatives talk about the dangers of a large government and centralized power in sort of diminishing the importance of the individual in society. But I think as I read history, many Americans and certainly many progressives have had similar concerns about the concentration of influence in corporations, going way back to the birth of major corporations and, in conglomerations in American life. We have the arisal of the railroads and, all of these new industries in the late 19th century and so forth. People felt like these things were displacing, community as we had known it. Is there a fundamental tension between big and civic health, right, in American life? Does it have to be the case that if you have big corporations, big government, that it tends against our ability to nurture the sorts of relationships that make civil society healthy? How would you describe the nature of that tension?
It's a tough one, I don't know. I've always tried to think about this within the principle that some of our church traditions call subsidiarity. And it just means that an issue should be dealt with, a social need should be dealt with at the most local level that it can be dealt with well. So, if the job is to build a national highway system, you don't want that handled by localities all over the country. So to me, the question of scale, I guess I'm not sure the answer really. I know that liberals have historically been concerned about concentrations of economic power, whereas conservatives have been more concerned about concentrations of political or governmental power. Maybe we should be concerned about both as a frame. But I keep coming back to this principle of subsidiarity, that the best way to handle something is as local as can be done to still do it, to still have it done the best way. The principle of subsidiarity says that there is this point that it will be handled best when is at a certain level of locality. So that's about the best I can do with that one.
Well, Pete, the reason I ask David that question is to wet it to something that Harry said and to throw a curveball at you to see if you enjoy taking a swing at it.
More of a fastball hitter, John, but
Okay, well, we'll get this one in the strike zone anyway. Well, Harry made the point that one thing that Tocqueville doesn't talk about so much is, I think, sort of, correct me if I'm wrong, Harry, but geographic locality and the importance of the church, the importance of the local school, and things that are sort of nested within the community that you live in a physical sort of space that anchors the relationships of the people that live in an area. Is that more or less on target, Harry? Or do you want to?
Well, they were also sites of work.
Sites of work, right. Mm-hmm.
So Tocqueville was a French aristocrat. He was not very attentive to work. He was ambivalent about work, but he was amazed by the enthusiasm that Americans had.
Right.
The Braver Angels often uses Lincoln, but it's important to know that, as historians like Eric Foner and others have pointed out, Lincoln's fundamental philosophy was work-centered. He said that labor is always prior to capital.
Mm-hmm.
And what he meant was the free labor tradition of people creating their communities, a society, were the foundation of a democratic life.
Right. Yeah.
And so it's the work theme that I want to really highlight here. And I don't think it's normally part of the associational language.
Well, so we build relationships with each other through work. Oh, Dave, if I could just round this off just very quickly. In our current time, though, Pete, we're having this conversation via Zoom, right? I do most of my work every day online. Speaking of centralization of power and influence, we have major social media companies, technology companies, and so forth, through whom we have so much of our communication these days. There's so much centralization, so much, at the same time, so much isolation, because we're not sharing physical space with each other so much. In the context of a 21st century moment like we're in now, when you have neither that same sort of day-to-day working relationship for at least a lot of the American people, and you have so much, concentration of power and influence with government, corporations, and now new technology, what does the project of invigorating American civic life and civil society look like in a context that's so different from anything that Tocqueville or Smith or even Dr. King could have imagined?
Well, I think it's important to start with first principles, right? Which is to say, or to ask the question, how's this COVID thing working out? I mean, the data is increasingly available to us of the social, health, suicide rates skyrocketing, perceptions of alienation and disconnection rising, divorce rates, engagement of kids in screens and what that's doing to them. We're going through an incredible experiment on whether this lifestyle, which is disconnected but only connected via screens, is actually human. And I think we're learning that we are actually social creatures. And social creatures to the extent that this screen time, I mean, I just look, my 8-year-old daughter, Elsa, FaceTime with her good friend Lisa is just not cutting it anymore. And the screen time that I have with other people, I mean, I caught myself the other day here in the office, and as with a lot of places, I'm here at the office at Pepperdine, but we're all being told to run kind of a skeletal crew. Everybody's encouraged to work remotely. We probably have a third of our staff here. I'm sitting here in an empty office. There's nobody within probably 100 yards of me. And at a certain point in the day, I just said, why am I so depressed? And I went home and chatted about it with my wife. She's like, you need to interact with people. And, but I'm like, I'm on Zoom meetings 6 hours a day.
Do you have students on campus?
We have a limited number who are living on campus, but all classes are online. So we've made some dorm space available. But again, I think, and I'm going to get to your point, your question, John, let's just agree with this, that this solitary existence that we've been experiencing, this social distancing, which for whatever the reasons it needs to be done, let's at least count the cost. It's not working out. And in that, the question becomes, well, then where do we find our places of affiliation? I'll go back to my daughter again. My daughter, Elsa, 8 years old, said, when this, and I'll quote her, when this pandemic is over, we are going to have some party. And what she meant by that was she was going to be around a lot of people. That's what a party meant. It wasn't going to be doing something on Zoom. And I wonder if when we have this God-blessed vaccine and we're actually able to meet with people and shake their hand, and I don't care, I'm going to shake hands and hug a lot of people when this is all over. I think we're going to realize how important finding these places of affiliation are to our humanity. It doesn't matter whether you're Democrat or Republican or American or, I mean, it doesn't matter. This is who we are as a people. And so the issues around how we find these places of affiliation, and which then give us our own identity, whether it's in church, whether it's in our local community and where we live and why we love where we live, whether it's in civil society. Those are going to provide the opportunities that when this is all done, I started going to a church 3 weeks ago that I'm not really a member of because it was a small group of 30 people that meets every Sunday. My wife and I started going just to worship with other people because I just couldn't do service online anymore. And I'm not unique there. So I think that what civil society offers us, these places of membership and affiliation, and I would argue these places where we live and these places where we work, to go to Harry's very good point, this place where I work here, this incredible Pepperdine, it's not the same. And it's not the same because I'm not getting a chance to see the people I work with, and whether it's at work or in civil society or otherwise. And I think, and my hope is that this civic awakening is in part going to be spurred on by our newly realized understanding of how much we need to be with other people physically.
Peter, Pete, thanks for being just so open and honest about how you're feeling at the moment, and I think that folks will sympathize. David, I apologize, I cut you off a moment ago, but you had something that you wanted.
No, let's keep going. Let's keep going.
Well, so I mean, same sort of question to you then here. I mean, we're in this 21st century moment. We're in this lockdown moment. Obviously, at Braver Angels, we've had to sort of adjust to this situation in order to continue our work. And well, I guess the conversation we're having now is is a part of that. But have you looked at your own work in any sort of a different light in the context of the current moment? I mean, what does it even mean to build civil society now that we're all locked at our computers?
You know, I don't really know what the potential is for meetings like we're having now. I don't, you know, we've taken a lot of our programs online. We've gotten a lot more people participating. I don't know in terms of the people's feelings of connectedness to one another, you know, the kind of building of trust. I mean, to me, the single biggest problem in the country today is the elimination, almost just very low levels of social trust. We just do not trust each other. Huge swaths of Americans really detest huge other swaths of Americans because they do not trust them. They do not trust their goodwill and their good intentions, and they view them as sort of aliens. So I don't know what the potential of online is. I mean, I mean, I can see each one of you. I'm looking at your faces. There are these beautiful human faces. And I can like, you know, I can't shake your hand. I can't accept a cookie and cup of coffee from you. But so maybe it's different. I sort of feel like the researchers are going to need to tell us the potential for this online experiences. I tend to be a little on the optimistic side. I don't see a return to, Peter, maybe you and I have a little bit of a different emphasis because I don't really see a return to localism in quite the way you're describing, given the amazing social changes that we could all enumerate. I don't really see a return to, you know, kind of front porch civil society in quite the same way. All of the, well before COVID, all of the institutions of civil society that were organized around that framework, they were all declining. And the membership was getting older, and younger people and people, non-upscale people, and especially non-upscale men, were simply not participating. And so, you know, maybe we have to struggle to find new social forms so that people can build bonds of affection and trust. Maybe online will do it. I just don't know. Maybe, does anybody else know? I mean, I don't.
I have a view on this.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be either or. So this is an example of connecting. My wife is South African, and we connect with our family in South Africa in a way that we never had before, because there's a lot of online activity. I also think that one of the interesting things about the Zoom phenomenon is going into people's homes. You know, it's not impersonal.
Yeah, we're seeing each other's homes.
But there's other sides. So I don't think you can have well, I completely agree, David, that we're at what I would call a war mentality with each other. And it's not only around issues and politics, it's around everyday life. We were talking about this in my church men's group the other day, and people had all sorts of examples, like the cook-offs on television in Great Britain. People help each other out, and they offer recipes, and they give advice. In the United States, it's cutthroat. You don't talk to anybody else. You go for the jugular, you try to kill them. So I think there's a war mentality that's really, and I actually think that the technologies of the social media in some ways inflame that. They're very sophisticated in inflaming and exacerbating tensions and conflicts. The algorithms are used very effectively to figure out what makes people mad. The technologies of campaigns have become, as NBC found, increasingly polarized using modern technologies. And my students say cancel culture is all over the media, where you basically wipe out people who. So I think there are downsides. I think there's some positives about modern technologies, but I also think that we need. I agree here with Pete. We need to revitalize. We need to develop a mission of revitalizing what I would call civic spaces in communities. So they're the great model, from my experience, are beauty parlors and churches and the civil rights movement and businesses. But also, when I was at the Humphrey Institute for many years, I would always tell my students the story of Hubert Humphrey's father. He was a druggist in a little town in South Dakota called Doland, 600. So his mission in life was to create that drugstore where he was one of 6 Democrats in a town of 600 Republicans, the civic center of that town. And it was full of discussion and debate and civic projects and a lending library and music. It was a civic hub. He at one point was elected mayor, but he thought that was the least interesting thing he did. And Humphrey said he learned his whole worldview from behind the counter in his father's drugstore. Without those kind of civic anchoring institutions where we interact with people who are different, we develop relationships, we learn to deal with different ideas, we've lost that. And I think that has a lot to do with the way we've seen the erosion of the civic dimensions of a lot of work, like the business person or the teacher or the clergy, who saw themselves as a civic actor in communities, not simply in their own bubble. And we need to develop a lot of ways for institutions or organizations to look outward and reconnect with the life of communities. So I'm somewhere in between, but I feel strongly about both sides of the argument too.
Right. Well, and so Braver Angels, obviously in the work that we're doing here, and again, this is an example of it. We are creating in the digital space at present a chance for us to connect in a public square sort of environment. I mean, this is what this is. We can see each other. We can communicate. It's weird, right? Because we can't shake hands. We can't, we can't make that physical sort of touch. And yet, we are sharing some parts of ourselves here in a real sort of way. I had a thought, but David, I saw your hand there.
Just saying, okay, so here's a thought. We had a event not too long ago, a debate about guns, and it was co-sponsored by two grassroots groups, the Ohio Buckeye Firearms Association, which is the biggest NRA affiliate pro-gun group in Ohio, in the Midwest, and then the National Association of Clergy concerned with more gun regulation. These two organizations that had completely different political and agendas with respect to guns. And but what one of the things that I've started thinking about, and the others, is what if they had an interaction online, they talked to one another and decided that they wanted to continue to build some kind of relationship with people who were different, because they just had a reason for wanting to connect with somebody else. Why couldn't they form an association of some kind digitally, a group? It doesn't matter where they live. They don't have to go to the Pa's kettle. They can, why not? Because the thing I worry about, Harry, the thing about Hubert Humphrey's father, he grew up in a town where they all were born and raised in that town. There are very few towns like that anymore, and there are fewer every day. And so to me, I mourn the loss of local civil society institutions that were once just up and down every American street. It just almost brings me to tears sometimes when I even think about it, because I was a kid in that world a little bit, at least among my white Southern piece of it. And, but wishing for a return to those forms, I don't really see the strategy there. To me, it's like, what are the new forms that help people build relationships of trust with one another, fewer and fewer of which depend upon their living next door to one another and going to one place together?
It doesn't have to be either or, though, David.
No, it's not either or, but those forms have been in decline for a half a century.
But look at the library world, for example. The libraries are now talking about themselves as civic centers, new 21st century civic centers.
Well, they have been, right?
Harry, David, let's get Pete back in here.
All right, you solve it, Pete. You fix this.
So Pete, I guess the question is about localism. How much is localism, in the way we have known it, just sort of the necessary anchor of a healthy civil society? Or in your view, is there a way in which sort of the spirit of localism can kind of evolve into this context? I don't think we're expecting you to solve every aspect of this question, but do you have some instincts in terms of the evolution of localism, perhaps? Or, is there anything in that?
Well, I do think that localism is geographically based and sensitive. Mm-hmm. And I think a love for where you live is necessary as an engine for developing these other bonds of affiliation. But it's very real, right? So I'm going to tell a very quick story. As you know, John, I'm one of 4 Republicans that lived in Santa Monica for many years. We just moved on to campus. And I gave a talk last year. A friend of mine invited me to speak to his class at, it was kind of a continuing education thing for older residents of Santa Monica. And he asked me to talk about the conservative movement and about the American project. And I said, sure, Bob Stern. And he warned me about a week out. He said, Pete, I just want to let you know that all these residents here, there's going to be about 125 people in this class, and all of them are on the left. So I just want you to be ready for that. I said, I've lived in Santa Monica for 12 years. I know the political leanings of this town. And so I began my comments by saying that Santa Monica was the most conservative community in California. And of course, everybody started looking at each other. And then I said, well, you know, my wife happens to be 4th generation Santa Monican, which she is. And my in-laws, her parents, who now live down in Orange County, whenever they're back in Santa Monica to visit us, they just remark at how much has changed and just how great Santa Monica used to be back in the 50s and 60s, this idyllic beach town and very kind of close to Los Angeles, but also distant. I'm looking out at the crowd and everybody's kind of like looking at each other, giving these knowing glances. And I said, yeah, but when they visit here, everything's gotten so fast and it seems like everything's changing. And then I said, and I took a pause and I said, it's almost like they want to make Santa Monica great again. And John, you could have heard a pin drop in that room. But what I was touching on there, now Santa Monica is kind of a metropolitan, it's a city of 125,000 people. It's not, you know, Bismarck, North Dakota, or wherever where it is we're talking about, where these idyllic Scandinavian towns of, you know, 750 people. But there's something there that you can't quite describe. You can describe it in nostalgic looking back, but there's also other ways that you can describe what you love about where you live. And I'm sure the person who just moves into Santa Monica today loves Santa Monica for what it is. And that may be very different than the person who is 3rd or 4th generation living in that town. But it's all to say that they can at least name something about why they love where they live. And this can be true in all different levels of household income. It can be different, you know, all different types of ethnic backgrounds. And I do think that is, I think unless we're able to name what that is, then we are going to tend to get, we're going to tend to find our affiliation at levels of a scale that are very difficult to handle. And if that scale is also only online, again, I think it's very difficult. There is something about being with neighbors, at least my experience, where you know there's not a single neighbor of mine who voted the way I did back in 2016 or 12 or name any election. But I'd be happy to argue with anybody why Santa Monica is one of America's great cities and why I loved it. And so I do think that there's something there to the importance of localism, which isn't just about subsidiarity and the mechanisms of policy making and decision making. All that is important. And if you don't have those things, you don't really have the opportunity for civil society and local government to flourish. But at the same time, I'm still going to keep coming back to your own ability to say why you love where you live, warts and all.
The one little anecdote I'll share is that when when my dad was bringing me up, he used to talk about how free agency had kind of messed up baseball and a lot of major league sports in his opinion, because before a certain point, players who were drafted to a certain team in baseball, they stayed on that team their entire careers. And in so doing, you know, Willie Mays was a part of the life of San Francisco. He was my father's favorite baseball player. Even though he was, Willie was from the South somewhere originally, I think. I have to double check that. But he became a part of life in San Francisco. I grew up, in the 90s. I remember Kobe Bryant extremely well. I remember when he came into the league, and guys get traded in the NBA all the time, but Kobe played his whole career, after coming to LA from Charlotte. He played his whole career in LA. And when he died, I live in South LA. I live in South Los Angeles, South Central Los Angeles. I can go down 2 blocks and see 2 full-size murals on the sides of buildings of Kobe Bryant and his daughter, artistic homages to a person who just embodied kind of this spirit of this place that we all live in. We share basketball, we share the Forum and the Staples Center, we shared Kobe Bryant, we shared the victories of the LA Lakers, and so on and so forth. And this is why I thought this would be an interesting conversation for us to have here today, folks, because I think that they're all things that we love on this. I'm not talking about just folks speaking on this panel. I'm talking about each and every one of you. They're all things I think that we love about our country, about places where we've lived, connections we felt with our neighbors, so on and so forth. And maintaining those relationships has got to be important to the health of democracy, right? The health of
John, okay, so here's what I want to just, I am as happy as anybody to remember and wish for the continuation and renewal of local associations of people who live near one another and love their community. I would say that if our objective as a society that is facing very perilous times due to a lack of social trust, if that is the prescription, if that is what's ailing us, that we're coming to fear and detest one another based on political belief because we do not trust each other. If that's the problem, I want to know what's the solution. What's our plan? What's our goal? And I think that simply, with due respect, Pete, I think that simply saying, let's get local, that does not strike me as an adequate plan. So I want to know what the plan is.
So let me respond to that.
And then we'll swing back to you, Harry.
I have a point.
Yes.
What I'm saying is that if it's not part of the mix, the reason we're having these federal, national level arguments over politics is, which when you think about it are really ridiculous, right? I mean, there is this concept of rational ignorance, right? The political scientists tell us that the larger the election, the larger the scope of the election, the less our actual impact on that election. So everybody's vote on this screen, 129 participants, is not going to make any dent on who is elected president of the United States in several months. Yet we get into these knockdown, drag out, polarized arguments with each other as if we can actually impact these national level discussions and decisions. So what I'm saying, David, is that if we're not going to, here's what I call my bumper sticker approach to civic engagement. If we're not able to find the places where we actually connect with each other. So in Santa Monica, when I realize that there's not a single person who thinks the way that I do politically, but we both agree on our love for where we live, that's at least a starting point for finding opportunities to understand why that other person thinks the way they do. And I would argue, Robert Putnam did an incredible study on 40 American cities called E Pluribus Unum back in 2006.
Yeah.
And he found that in those cities, and he found rather uncomfortably because he wasn't seeking this result, The higher the levels of ethnic diversity, the lower levels of civic trust. And there were only two places
That's
where
been shown in plenty of other studies as well. Yeah.
and there were only two places that he found across the 40 cities where there was a positive correlation between ethnic diversity and civic trust. Large Protestant megachurches and large Catholic churches.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So unless I believe the church is also a part of this. Now, why is the church so beautiful at doing this? Because it sets above all of its parishioners a certain being that we are loved by and accountable to, which tends to equalize all of us else out and makes us again realize that we are all creatures of God. Now,
why do you say they're doing a good job? I think they're doing a horrible job.
I'm not saying they're doing a good job. I'm saying how important they are when Putnam finds that they're the only two places where in these increasingly diverse municipal areas in which we are increasingly living, those were the two places where the kinds of things that you're saying you want, which we all want, increasing civic trust with increasing levels of ethnic diversity, that's where it was happening.
Those two church institutions, yeah.
Gentlemen, let's throw the ball to Harry, and then I want to go ahead and start getting folks questions in the room. But Harry, go ahead and round us out here before we turn to our friends and guests.
Well, this is a long discussion, but I want to go back to cooperative work with public products and meetings, what we call public work, as a kind of third language below the individualist competitive first language of politics, to use Robert Bella's terms, the second language, which is community, which is everybody's been talking about here. David and Pete, for all of your differences, you're talking about a sense of community. But I think that actually a strong, sustained sense of community and connection and associational life is sustained through a sense of we're helping to create this sucker. So in the 1990s, I did a book with a colleague, Nan Carey, that had a lot on the Civilian Conservation Corps of the 1930s. You know, poor guys, often put together from very different backgrounds, rural, urban, different regions of the country. To a single person, they said it was a life-changing experience. Because they said they came to feel that they were creating an American treasure. I mean, 2 billion trees, you know, thousands of parks, hundreds of thousands of roads still in existence. And the interesting thing about that was that experience, it's useful to talk about the difference between that and the service experiences of Vista and AmeriCorps, which were seen as idealistic moments before you got into the real world. The Civilian Conservation Corps stayed with people all their lives because they felt they were developed a sense of civic responsibility, which they could express through their work. And in our conversations, we found they did that as teachers, as business people, as janitors, whatever they did, they continued to feel that they were able to help to create their places. Now, I don't think people have a sustained affection either in a local community or a church unless they feel they're helping to make the place. I think that,
maybe another example is the military, right? Because that is a tremendous institution that brings people together from all walks of life and develops tremendous bonds. So I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, my wife and I, who's South African and was involved in the anti-apartheid movement, we both did a workshop for the Coast Guard. My daughter's in the Coast Guard, a Coast Guard unit in Boston, the Boston region, and they talked a lot about that because I was saying the power of the work that I saw in the movement in bringing people together and helping people feel that they were really creating a larger whole. And just one final note here, a contemporary story. This is not antiquated, nostalgic memory. In rural Missouri, we have a youth initiative in which young people do public work called Public Achievement, spread to a number of countries. In rural Missouri, which was experiencing this was northwest corner, an enormous outflux of young people, they discovered that young people who did public work through their schools and their projects actually had a new sense of connection to their places. So a foundation called Heartland has been spreading that across the whole region and has found dramatic changes in young people's expectation about staying in their region, from 20% 20 years ago to now 80% say they're going to stay in the region. And it's directly because they feel they're helping to create and make a contribution to the place.
Indeed. Okay. All right. So there's plenty more to be said, but folks, we want each and every one of you to jump in, contribute to the conversation, or at least as many of you as we can get in. And so if folks have questions, go ahead and click that little raise hand. Well, first of all, I forgot to say something very important. We have a bit of a tradition here at Braver Angels, adapting to our new digital reality and so forth. It can be hard to clap in the traditional sense via Zoom, but what we can do is employ the sign language method for applause, which just so happens to be what we just like what we usually refer to as jazz hands. And so, ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause or jazz hands for David Blankenhorn, Harry Boyte, and Pete Peterson for steering us through this wonderful conversation. There we go. Yes, indeed. All right, folks. Now let's go ahead and get some questions in. So if anybody has a question here, okay, let me go ahead and pull up my participant screen. Let me say something else. With your question, make sure that it is in fact a question and not a speech. Some of you may have noticed that I can take up to about 2, 3, or 5 minutes going on a lengthy walk around the block before I get to the point of my own question. That is the exclusive privilege of the moderator. If all of you guys do that, we won't get to more than 1 or 2 of you. But to start, so I'll have to cut folks off if they get too long. But having said that, let's go ahead and jump in. Amber Lewis, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question of any of the speakers you like.
Well, so my husband's going to ask the question. This is David. Hi. So I'm jumping off of her. I did my master's capstone in St. Paul. I did just a study of civic engagement based off of district councils. And the question about that Peter brought up with Santa Monica being so large and doing this, I would wonder if Professor Boyte would talk more about with the district councils in St. Paul and how they break down the larger metropolitan area of St. Paul to where there is an ability to have that local engagement and build that sense of community and civic trust. Do you think that would work in other cities or beyond, in other cities beyond Minnesota?
Thanks, it's a good question. I think it's a complicated story in St. Paul. In some places like the West Side, the district council is really quite strong. I think it's strong because it's not simply a standalone. As a governmental body, you have the problem of it's in a way not owned by the people. It's seen as the entity of the city. In the West Side, where we've done a lot of work with immigrants, it's as you probably know, a long time immigrant community. It used to be Jewish immigrants, and now it's Hmong and Somali and Latino. But there are a lot of civic organizations that interact with the district council on the West Side of St. Paul. So it has a lot of life. I don't think it's because of the standalone quality. I think, and I also think actually there are a lot of businesses which play an important role in that process too. And the school on the West Side, which was actually the creation of the community, is an anchor institution. Humboldt people feel a lot of identification with. So I think government can play a role, but it can't drive the process of civic revitalization and a sense of agency. You know, another quote that I want to put in the mix on Tocqueville, he said, "The art of association is a mother science of democracy," which means people need to develop relationships with each other across differences. That, he said, was the heart of democracy. And without that, then people look to great leaders and government institutions. So how do we nurture and catalyze self-organized and empowering efforts of citizens is a question. I think the West Side, I would say, is a good example of where that's been pretty successful.
Okay, excellent. Next question up is from Jacqueline Brownlee. Jacqueline, go ahead and unmute yourself if you're muted. and ask your question of any of our speakers.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for this opportunity and listening to the different points of views, et cetera. This has been very powerful for me. And I know we're trying to look at one question, but another question comes to me, and that is, how do we, it seems like a lot of folks in the US do not want to wear the mask. They do not want to conform to the social distancing. And how and why is this happening? And I'm wondering if it's because the people that are most outspoken on social media, on the news, with good intentions, talk about how much we are suffering and what we need to do this and we need to do that. How effective do you think it could be if we emphasize things we could do to survive at a quality level? And in the beginning, there were ways that people communicated, that the way they shared music, etc. And I'd like to ask the first speaker from Pepperdine, where I got my doctorate, how effective does he think it could be to change our emphasis, or in addition to talk about opportunities that this pandemic is giving us for new ways of thinking, new ways of communicating, and new experiences?
Okay, Pete, you're up.
So, Jacqueline, thank you for your question. I'm actually pretty optimistic. I mean, the title of this conversation is Civic Awakening with a question mark. And I think that for the reasons that I mentioned before, I don't know that it necessarily means new ways of thinking. My hope is that it's a new appreciation for what has always been sort of true of us as human beings and as Americans, which is to say that we really do need one another. That it's essential for our moving forward as a culture to understand how dependent we are on one another. In some ways, the masks is almost like a metaphor for the greater understanding of how dependent we are on one another. But I think it can be taken to another level when we do have this vaccine, that as much as I love this, and we're all, I mean, Zoom is going to be a part of our work life and family life. I have family in Australia that I'm able to communicate with, and you know, this has all made this much more possible. But I hope it also just develops, and I think frankly, Jacqueline, this is part of the reason why we're seeing such increasing tension and polarization. I think some of it is frankly the natural outgrowth of people being forced to distance themselves. And the reactions are becoming increasingly irrational unless you see them in light of the fact that we are not living in a rational existence right now. This is not rational, this is not rational. And so I think if we can develop that kind of appreciation about how much we really do need one another physically, that this will always be a part of how we do things going forward, but it can't be the only way. And again, that's where I hope is going to be the genesis of this civic awakening, that there will be this new revitalized understanding of how much we do need one another, and that at the local level is a scale where our work can have the greatest impact, and our appreciation and connection to one another is most easily accomplished.
May I just make one really quick comment? It's been my experience that we are closer to one another, that we're doing more for one another in many instances. So I just wanted to say that.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the question. Okay, next up we have, oh, I just lost it. Eli Persky. Eli, go ahead and unmute, ask your question.
Hi, this is Eli in Minneapolis. I want to pick up on the, thank you, fellow Minneapolitans.
Yeah, we have a little contingent here.
I blame Bill Doherty, but in any way, continue.
I want to pick up on the localism versus new forms of civic engagement, and ask, well, actually, first an observation. My observation is that Braver Angels has effectively digitized its in-person offerings, and that's excellent. And my question is, are there any digital first players in the civic engagement space that you're intrigued by that started with the digital format?
Well, David, do you have an answer to that?
No, I don't, but it is a great question. And I'm going to make it a point to look around. That's a great question.
Yeah.
Maybe somebody else on the call knows something about it, but.
Well, our friends at Living Room Conversations, their model, I believe, started off.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah, more or less exclusively online. And there are other examples, to be sure. I mean, we started. I guess I'll just take a little point of privilege and say we started toying around with some online offerings, before the shutdown went into place. But it was necessity that drove us to, as you say, just sort of transitioning everything online in the way that we have. The limitation of online engagement before was always just that on the one hand, you could reach farther. On the other hand, it seemed like it didn't quite have the same sort of intimacy to it, right? That physical interaction has. And so that's to Pete's point, obviously, and much of what we've said here already. But, having said that, I think that this interaction we're having, Eli, is meaningful, So there's clearly some reason for optimism with respect to the utility of this, even while we all want to get to a different kind of normal than the one we're at now, I think.
Besides face-to-face local and besides online, attempts to communicate online, if you think about, just close your eyes and imagine in your memory of the last few years, what are the most dramatic forms of civic expression, passion, strong feelings about something in the country? I mean, the response to the Floyd killing was not about lots of local groups. It was not about, it was just about a certain outpouring that didn't seem to have any central organization of any kind. Mm-hmm. And if you think to the Arab Spring several years ago, where governments fell and huge changes were ignited across the Arab world, people just were on their cell phones texting one another, and hundreds of thousands of people gathered in squares, and presidents resigned. So to me, I'm just kind of like want to kind of step back like I'm a child, and I just want to look and see what's causing people to step into civic life, to be willing to step outside of the ordinary and challenge this I think just astonishingly toxic public culture we have right now. And regardless of what you think about the protests, it was an astonishing civic occurrence. And as far as I have no idea who the leaders were. I don't think there were any leaders.
Indeed. Well, maybe we'll get some more insight into some of these categories here as we take some more questions. Next on my list is Mary Godwin. Mary, go ahead and unmute and ask your question of any of our speakers.
Sure. So I'm coming from Mexico. My name is Mary. And we talked a lot about loneliness tonight. And I just wanted to note that I think the physical loneliness is only a very small part of what a lot of people feel right now. A lot of people, especially young people that I've talked to, feel a loneliness that comes from, it's loneliness inside a community, and it's loneliness because of a feeling of helplessness. They can't connect with the community and they can't fix the problems that they see around them. So if that's the kind of loneliness we're trying to help people with, how do we help people who feel lonely in that way?
Okay. And well, Harry, would you like to jump on that one?
Let me say something I think is really impressive to me about Braver Angels. And this is from someone who's followed it closely. Bill Doherty is a very old colleague, but only in the last several months have I been active in the With Malice Toward None. But I think there's actually a lot of lessons here in Braver Angels. One is it's an organization people are creating together. So there's definitely a work creation, co-creation dimension. I think to the loneliness people feel, we live in a very impersonal world. Institutions are impersonal. Schools are impersonal. Businesses are often impersonal, even if they're pretty small. Braver Angels is very relational. Its focus is not on, it has all sorts of ideas, but it's not cognitive as much as built around building relationships and exploring relationships. And then the second dimension of that is that it's an asset-based approach rather than a deficit-based approach. I think and this is a plague of technocracy and expert domination and the best and the brightest and credentialism and all of that. I think we live in a society and teaching and tests and all of that, hyper-competitiveness. We live in a world that's very deficit-focused. What's wrong with people? Who's the best? Kind of linearity. Who's worst? Everything is measured. And one of the really good things about Braver Angels in the workshops and in the discussions of race, other things, is that it begins with people's strengths. What do you appreciate? What are your values? Who are you? What you have to contribute? That's really distinctive, and it's very countercultural. And then the final thing I think is that it does create kind of a sense of abundance, not scarcity. That the deficit, rationalism, impersonality also is connected, and the loneliness that comes out of that is really connected to a sense of impoverishment, and everybody is looking for who has more, but there's an abundance. So I think I just want to give a statement of appreciation for some of the really key ingredients about Braver Angels that are going to scale, and I think that are really important in speaking to the sense of disconnection people have.
Also, what my friend just said, the woman who just spoke, I feel that kind of loneliness whenever I feel like, there's no way to enact, I think what she said was we feel like you can't do anything about what you're seeing. You can't, you're isolated in a way that prevents you from doing things. You're powerless. And so I think one of the answers in all this puzzle might be, what are the forms of civic life, of association, that can allow people to feel like that even if it's a small thing they're doing something. They're not waiting around for some other person to let them do something. They're not waiting for a new president. They're not waiting for permission from the boss. They're just able to take an action. And I felt, for me, it's really been a lifesaver for me, because otherwise you just feel, there's a sense of passivity that does cause you to withdraw, feel depressed. So in Braver Angels, we found that we don't have to talk anybody into anything. We don't have to persuade them there's a problem. All we have to do is say, this is an opportunity for you to do a thing. This is and so I don't know about forms and everything else, but I do know the ability, the confidence or the belief that you can take an action has got to be a key to any concept of strengthening civic life.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Mary. That was a profound question. I see that we have a Terry Webb. It says Terry Webb, PA. I assume that means Pennsylvania. I'm
Yes.
going to go to Terry just so we can get away from all these Minnesotans. So,
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to speak as a Pennsylvanian.
okay.
But I wanted to pick up on the issue of one of the comments that was made is the church really a center for civic discourse, which it could have been in the past. I've done some work in Africa, and I would say the church in Africa is a center for civic discourse and also for civic unrest in terms of settling issues. And before I discovered Braver Angels, I was trying to take a program to the churches to see if we could begin that civic discourse. My question, I think, to Peter, probably, and David and Harry too, is there a possibility that the churches can be involved in some kind of leadership in terms of civic discourse? Because right now, they're just kind of little oasis islands of one opinion or another, or they just don't talk to each other.
Pete, why don't you take that, and David and Harry, if you guys want to jump on at the end there, you guys can too. Peter.
Yeah, I mean, actually, it so happens that on Friday of this week, we're sponsoring a webinar with our friends at a group called the Trinity Forum, which is a faith-based organization based in Washington, D.C. that does some great events around the intersection of faith and politics. And on Friday, we're going to be hosting a gentleman by the name of Justin Giboney, who's come out, leads an organization called the AND campaign, AND campaign, and has a new book out on the subject. But essentially, the book is about how do people of faith who may disagree politically, where are the places where we can find points of agreement that can lead to a flourishing society. And I'll just throw that out as an example. It would be a great kind of local book club thing. It's not, it's kind of a more general Christian message, I would say, not particularly denominational. And it's not political. He happens to be a person more on the center left, but this is definitely a set of conversations that he's been engaged with and obviously writes about in this book that involves people from across the spectrum. And I would just add, I think actually the greater problem in the church right now is that we've lost sight of the church's mission and focus on the importance of civic engagement. We either seem to be in this place where we're either polarized or apathetic. And I think that, obviously the sweet spot, as it often is, the golden mean is somewhere in the middle. And I do think Giboney is one of those voices out there who is promoting a very compelling message.
Okay. Next up, Corey Herring. Corey, go ahead and ask your question. Do we still have Corey, or Corey? If
I'm here.
Okay, there you go.
You guys hear me? Hey, thank you. First off, everyone, for taking the time to speak with us. Really interesting topics that I haven't really considered before, such as distrust in the community. And I know we were talking about Kobe Bryant just real quick, but I like to think about it in terms of sports. Kobe Bryant modeled his game after Michael Jordan, but Kobe Bryant wasn't really like a team player. So I think that trust really comes from honesty, truthfulness, and then that truthfulness needs to be validated. If Kobe Bryant passes the ball to you and you miss it, he probably won't pass you the ball again. But my question is you referenced some study by a guy named Putnam. It seemed to suggest that we as Americans are not a collective like how we were after 9/11. And if you could just talk a bit about, is that the case? I'm not familiar with the study, but you mentioned it and I would just like to hear more. So,
Pete, I think that's directed at you.
Yeah, so the title of the study is actually E Pluribus Unum. You can find the PDF, just Google Putnam and E Pluribus Unum and you can find it. It's a report that looks at 40 major American cities and evaluates them on levels of civic trust, really just at the municipal level. And so, Corey, I think you bring up a great point, right? So where was a time where people felt connected? And as someone who was in New York on 9/11, I think most, maybe not you, Quinn, probably too young, but I think most of us remember those days and weeks and months after 9/11, how close we felt to one another, this kind of weird shared experience. And I think what's so ironic about that is that sometimes it demands these periods of really utter tragedy to make us realize, again, how we do need each other and the things that we really do find in common. And as I was mentioning before to Jacqueline, so we have graduate policy students here, and I talked about how my own experience in 9/11 in New York kind of set me on this career trajectory away from the private sector and now working in academia and policy. And I felt I've had these kind of flashback experiences over the last 5 months to the days and weeks and months after 9/11. And I just feel like there's something going on in the country, very different circumstances, right? Very different circumstances. But in many ways, we are actually feeling an experience so similar to one another that we actually didn't in 9/11. If you didn't live in New York on 9/11 or in Washington or in Pennsylvania, I don't think it would be possible to understand the scale and scope of what happened there. You felt it as an American, but there was another level, I think, that those of us who were living in that area felt. This thing with the pandemic, we're all going through the same thing. But at the same time, we're not connecting with one another. And my hope is that there is going to be a time when this is over. I know it's hard to believe, but we may only be a few months away from this damn thing being over. And my hope is that what will be unleashed, again, is this greater understanding of how much we need each other and how much we've all gone through a historic event. And we're going to need each other to get through the other side of this as well, by the way. When this is over, there's going to be a lot of healing that needs to happen personally and corporately. And I hope that we're able to call on some of those other parts of our identity, those common ones that we experienced after 9/11, that we'll be able to summon to heal after all this is done.
Yeah. Just one quick thing that I wanted to add related to Mr. Herring's question. You said that we're not really a unity, where there's a division along either race or other lines. What Putnam found is that if you just put people of different races or different, identities, different languages, if you just put them together, just put them side by side, they don't trust each other as much as they would have if they were the same. So trust decreases in a situation where there's the kind of diversity that is in so much of America. But there is a flip side to that, which Putnam also points out, which is that we're smarter and make better decisions if a diverse group of people make those decisions. The evidence is a diverse group makes better decisions than either a like-minded group or the smartest person in the room. And so as we get used to each other and as time goes on, hopefully there's a strength that comes from this. And so what Putnam emphasizes that this drop in trust that comes from people of different races and backgrounds coming together does not have to be permanent. It can actually produce a strength ultimately that is greater than the homogeneous. So I don't know if that answers part of your question, but just wanted to bring that up.
That makes perfect sense to me. Yeah.
I have a comment here. I
Pretty
do.
quick, Harry, because I want to get a couple more questions in if we can.
Sure. Well, I think there's COVID. I think there are other crises too, that if we think about them not in partisan terms, but as collective challenges, like climate, no reason we have to have a state-centered liberal approach to climate change. It can be a common task that we all engage in different ways and tap different kinds of energy, and just like we do around hurricanes and natural disasters. And I would say the racial question can be a collective work, and issues of economic development and recovery can be. I want to add one thing that Putnam doesn't really address, because I've looked at a lot of communities. Communities can develop that kind of collective wisdom, David, if they consciously, intentionally develop skills of connection across differences. Now, it used to happen more spontaneously in the Humphrey drug stores. So now it has to be more intentional. But there are a lot of ways that people have developed to do that. And it's not simply discourse, it's also one-on-one meetings. It's thinking politically about how do you make change in the community,
Yeah.
strategically.
That's a
So
great
there's
point.
actually a lot of wisdom about that now.
Indeed. And I would like to make the point, since we referenced Michael Jordan, that Michael Jordan himself was a ball hog early in his career, but when he started passing the ball, he scored fewer points, but that's when his team started winning championships. So somehow I feel like that's relevant here.
That's relevant.
Okay, let's see. Gene Hinson, go ahead, unmute yourself and ask your question. If you're still with us. Is Gene Hinson here, if I'm saying that correctly? Perhaps not.
Yes,
Oh.
I'm here, but I've been frozen I have to stop my video and then unfreeze myself.
That's fine. You got in just under the tag, so to speak. Now I'm using baseball analogies. Go ahead, ask your question, Gene.
Yeah,
You barely beat the buzzer.
Yeah, exactly.
well, I'm 71 and I'm not tech-wise really fast.
Okay, I'm 33 and I'm not either. That's fine.
Again, a shout out to Braver Angels for being a place that I could find to do something during COVID. But my question is there something endemic to my biases that are going to come through here? American brand of capitalism. People have talked about is it being different than capitalism in other places? And I don't know if it's the winner take all, or that it produces more haves and have-nots, or I'm not sure exactly, or that what it is. But is there something that, what is the impact of that and the connection to? Is there something that doesn't allow people to breach that divide of difference because we have mythic ideas about, pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, and then there's the welfare queen, and then but a lot of different ideas that are kind of floating around in my head. But how does that connect to, does that enable, is it really, I see that as really disabling the civic awakening, because I see that as, it's an anti-local.
Okay.
Big business, corporatism, maybe that's what it is, but monopoly.
Right. So is American capitalism problematic to the project of civil society? Yes. Do we have anybody who wants to jump up and field that one? I see Harry.
Well, I think the 19th century was characterized by small-scale property. That was, of course, the vision of freed slaves for 40 acres and a mule. It wasn't socialism, it wasn't collectivized, but it was seen as a foundation for involvement. I think there's signs that may be coming back. So the Business Roundtable, America's largest corporations, issued a statement this year calling for a shift from what they called shareholder capitalism, where basically the only question that businesses interrogate is how much profit do they make for their shareholders, to what's called stakeholder capitalism. Now, I don't think that a statement from the big businesses is going to make it happen. I think it's going to take a lot of organizing, but it points towards something really important. We have to stop thinking about business as a bubble unto itself and think about its responsibility and accountability to all sorts of stakeholders, the workers involved, the communities involved, the families in communities, the civic life of communities. in the Twin Cities, I did a lot of interviews with business leaders back 20 years ago. There was a great sense of loss at every level, from small business to bigger business, that we had lost the civic responsibility and identities of businesses. So I think a part of the challenge is to figure out ways to bring that back and to make that part of culture as well as policy.
Pete, it looks like you want to add on to that.
Yeah, I agree that, I don't know if you'd call it American style capitalism, but certainly the corporatism is something that is very disturbing. I would not want to lose sight of American style consumerism, which puts us all on the screen on the hook, because it demands a certain amount of behavior change or modification as it relates to how we spend our money. And I think as much as corporatism and the influence of big business is something that we should definitely be concerned about, the squeezing out of smaller businesses by large corporate international retailers and so forth, I think are things that we all should be suspicious of and concerned about and exploring policy responses to. But the thing that we can't get a policy response to is what we do with our own money. And I think the value that we as a culture have placed on things versus people is one, unfortunately, that comes along with a culture of increasing wealth, even with the separation of the so-called haves and have-nots. The focus that our culture places on consumeristic behavior is something that is antithetical to the kinds of civic community building, volunteerism, and personal philanthropy, which is not household income related, that we also be concerned about as well.
Indeed. Next, we have Victor Velasquez. Victor, go ahead, and I think hopefully we can squeeze in another one after you, Victor. But go ahead.
I really know that I don't look like Victor Velasquez.
No.
Actually, my husband and I share a Zoom screen, and for some reason, it's got his name on it. So I'm Debbie. Hi, everybody.
Debbie, I had a Victor quota for tonight, and you have undermined that. But that's
Did
okay.
I mess it up for you? I'm so sorry.
The bright side is our Debbie quota has now been reached.
Oh, okay. What I wanted to talk about was, we're talking about this time of great anger in our country and distrust. And I have been wondering if on a society's level, rather than at an individual level, if we are looking at something like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's Stages of Death and Dying, as a society, our country has changed from where it was in the 1950s to where it is today. And there are a group of people that have just gone right along with that change and adapted to it, and it didn't seem to affect them. And there's another large segment of the society that is deeply grieving the loss of America as they knew it. And I'm wondering if we were to look at what's going on in the country as a collective instead of as an individual, if we're not going through those stages, initially starting with denial. And then, of course, we're definitely in the stage of anger. And it is my hope, I guess, that we do get through this process to a stage of acceptance and growth. But I was wondering if anybody else had some thoughts about that idea.
Well, I'm a Southerner by birth and upbringing, and I think there's just a lot of truth to what you're saying. And I see it a lot. And I also see a lot of people on either side of that divide sneering at the people on the other side of it. Rootless cosmopolitans,
Yes.
People who don't care about ordinary people who want to tell everybody else what to do, mess around in my business, you know, versus, who these backward racist people who can't understand that this is a new country and who are these ignorant people and so forth. I mean, so to me, part of it is getting away from that sneering at the people who feel upset that they're losing things, and sneering at the people who seem to be coming out on top of the new situation. I don't have any big answers for you, Debbie. I mean, we're involved, Brave Angels right now, we're involved in a thing in North Carolina, and in theory, what they're arguing about is whether the Confederate monument should be removed from the county courthouse in Gastonia, North Carolina. And you can imagine all that, and threats of violence and everything else. But underneath it, I really think is what you're talking about.
It's grief.
People who are ready to say, we have been treated badly a long time, and we now are no longer prepared to be treated badly. And other people who are saying, I'm losing everything that was an anchor for me. I'm losing my way of life, and and there's poignancy in all that. And then there's questions of justice, and there's questions of how societies make progress. But I'm saying that you're onto something, and that simply polarizing it into the good side and the bad side, I think that would be a big mistake.
I agree.
Okay.
I think we have to acknowledge that a lot of people are grieving. Yeah.
No, Debbie, I'm so sorry. We've got to bring it to a close now for the sake of time. But thank you so much for your question. Folks, the last thing I want to do here is before we check out officially, David, Harry, Pete, the title of our talk today was Civic Renewal with a question mark. Would each of you we have time for each of you to take between about 30 and 60 seconds and just register some last thoughts with us. What are the key things that you want us to take away from this conversation tonight if we're going to play a constructive role in making American civic life and civil society what it could be in an uncertain time? And I'm going to go ahead and start with Pete. Pete, just 30, 60 seconds, key thoughts.
I just want to go back to Corey's point before about the 9/11 time. Sometimes in this time of polarization, we forget when there were moments when there was actually some degree of social cohesion. Unfortunately, it took a tragedy like that to make it happen, but we are now going through one again. And my hope is that it will, as I've said several times here, make us more aware of our need for one another and for the importance of engaging locally at a scale and scope that we can actually see the impact of the work that we are doing in the civic space.
Indeed. David Blankenhorn, 30, 60 seconds or so, some final key thoughts.
It's that the main challenge for us, the main task, is to renew our trust in one another as decent people with whom we have something in common, despite our differences. That's it. That's the magic key. That is the necessary renewal that will make possible the renewal of our political life and other things. So it's the social trust. And I don't know all the best ways to do that. And maybe my friend Peter's right. Maybe we've been ignoring too much the local place aspect of it. Maybe face-to-face is, let's put a pin in those questions. But what we ought to do every day when we get out of bed and we think about what's good for our country is think about how to rediscover some notion of civic trust, what John Wood Jr. calls patriotic empathy. That's That's what'll fix what's broken more than any other single change.
Professor Harry Boyte, ending with you, sir.
Well, getting back to your first question, John, I would say nonviolence was not only about ending conflict, it was about building an inclusive community. It was called constructive nonviolence. We have seen moments of that. I would say the Great Depression, there's a wonderful archive called A New Deal for the Art, about art of the New Deal, which shows the whole people. I mean, very diverse. Harlem Renaissance, rural folks in the South, Chicago steelworkers, responding to the crisis of the New Deal through all sorts of energy. And it really changed the whole narrative of America. I think that's the hope, that we begin to see a constructive, nonviolent way to build an American community that is flourishing and that's inclusive. And part of the key will be that we recognize that we have common work to do as a whole people.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Harry. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, round of applause, Zoom-style jazz hands for David Blankenhorn, Harry Boyte, and Peter Peterson. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Thank you, John. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, absolutely.
Really enjoyed it. Thanks to everybody for being a part of it.
No, indeed. It's been a lot of fun. And thanks to all of you for coming out, for being a part of our program tonight. And in our closing seconds here, let me just say to you guys very quickly that, we're asking these questions about how is it we can move American social and civic life forward. Some of the answers are just present in the fact that we're all here together tonight. It really is. And so for anybody who is not currently a member of Braver Angels, Luke, go ahead and send around the link. We encourage you folks to join us, to be a part of the work that we are doing, because the work that we are doing really is the work of building up relationships. And I'd like to make a special plug for our Braver Angels alliances. Braver Angels has communities across the country. We've got 50 or so right now in different cities and states where you can meet, connect with, and work alongside members of Braver Angels who live in your community, who live in your region. And the reason that's important isn't just because it's important for us to be able to connect over political conversations, but it gives us an opportunity to share community together in the places where we live, even if we have to social distance while doing it, right? And so ultimately, as problematic as our politics are right now, as easy as it is to descend into tribalism and animosity, the fact that we can be here, have these conversations, see the best in each other, and build from there shows us what's possible in America tomorrow if we get that sort of civic muscle down in our relationships today. So don't lose faith and don't lose hope in the idea that the United States of America can and we will be better tomorrow than it is today. You folks are making sure of that right now. And so thank you all so much. Join us again next week. Next Wednesday, we'll be back with another one of these and a whole bunch of other things. Stay tuned, folks. We are out here building a house united. Until next time. Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Bye, everybody.
Take care now.
Good night, all.